Okay, this is the second part of the what is knowledge topic. This is going to focus mainly on the key objections or criticisms to the justified true belief or tripartite definition of knowledge that we started off with. And there's a few things that are going to be important, including the use of the terms necessary and sufficient that we looked at last week. So, as I said before, we need to know three types of knowledge. So we looked at ability, acquaintance, and propositional knowledge. And I explained that the one that this topic focuses on mostly is going to be propositional knowledge. So that's something that we need to be very, very clear on. Propositions are statements of what is the case. They assert something about the world. A proposition can be true or false. So propositions would include things like Paris is the capital of France, or it's raining outside, or my car's still in the car park. Anything which asserts a state of affairs is a proposition, as opposed to knowing how to ride a bike or being acquainted with the smell of fresh paint, for example. So the sort of things that we talked about last time were incorporated by the first few typical exam style questions here. So we looked at, as I've just mentioned, the three types of knowledge: ability, acquaintance, and propositional knowledge. Knowledge how, knowledge of, and knowledge that, in terms of the three types of knowledge. We talked a little bit about Linda Zagzebski's approach to how to define knowledge and the sorts of rules and guidance that philosophers should follow when laying out definitions of knowledge. So you would need to be explaining what she talks about with something having a real definition in this context, as opposed to something which is perhaps variable according to preference or taste or culture. Real definitions, if you remember, included things like water as H2O, and what Zagzebski is trying to do is to pin down knowledge in the way that we might pin down the definition of a term like water, to try and give a rigorous and theoretical definition of knowledge, which avoids the sort of pitfalls she gives for poor philosophical definitions. So it shouldn't be ad hoc or improvised, it shouldn't be obscure, it shouldn't be negatively defined by what it is not, and it shouldn't be circular. I think if you're defining those things or explaining those things in how we approach definitions, that's the central part of Zagzebski's point here. Most importantly, the last thing that we looked at was the tripartite definition of knowledge, and that's the key for this whole topic. So the three-part definition of knowledge as a justified true belief, that's really the central thing that this topic is revolving around. And last time we looked at how to explain the tripartite definition of knowledge, and I mentioned these terms necessary and sufficient. So that's really going to be the central thing, and then we'll look at various criticisms in this session about why that perhaps doesn't hold up to scrutiny. So the sorts of things that we might be asked here might revolve around Edmund Gettier and his famous objection to the tripartite definition of knowledge. And then there are various responses to Gettier's objection here. So people have tried to kind of improve on the tripartite definition in the light of Gettier's objection. That's really where the bulk of this debate goes, and that will be the topic of the third part that I will do in this series. So the essay question that we could potentially have on this would be something along the lines of: is knowledge a justified true belief, or is the best definition of propositional knowledge a justified true belief? So just to briefly recap on the tripartite definition of knowledge, because this is the thing that we will be criticising. The tripartite definition then has these three parts, and the debate, as I've explained going forwards, is going to be about criticisms of and attempts to improve on this tripartite definition. So for the tripartite definition, sometimes you'll see this explained as it's explaining when someone knows some proposition, or in the logical language, the logical form, sometimes it's stated as for S to know P. So for someone to know that proposition P, they must have these things. So S must believe that P is the case, so the belief condition. P, the proposition, must be true, the truth condition. I did talk in the notes about the belief condition being the internal criterion, the thing which is inside your mind, if you like. You must believe that something is the case. And then the truth condition, on at least some accounts of this, being the external criterion, and we'll come to that a bit later on. Finally, S must be justified in believing that P, so you must have some evidence or reason or backing for believing the proposition to be the case, and that was the key one really that Plato emphasized in coming up with this definition. And that's something that you really do need to be able to emphasize when you're explaining this. So the technical way of putting this was to say that each of these conditions is individually necessary. So each of them has to be there in order for this to hold. And then taken together, they automatically generate, they are enough to have the thing that we're after, which in this case is knowledge. So necessary means that it has to be there. If you take it away, it's no longer the thing that you're looking for. Jointly sufficient means that if you have the things in place, then it is the thing that you're looking for. So the key was the justification condition, and again we talked about this last time, but just to emphasize, because this is the central point, the justification condition is central because that rules out, or is supposed to rule out, as we'll see, the idea of luck or coincidence here. So think back to Plato's jury example. They convict somebody on the basis of gossip and hearsay. The idea is that that is not justified. They have a true belief. In his example, they actually get the right verdict, but they didn't have knowledge because they were going on hearsay. So their belief was not properly justified. And this is that the whole kind of topic rests on this central intuition, which is that knowledge is different to a lucky truth. Okay, so again, a quick recap just on the central terms, because these are the ones which the whole topic will revolve around going forwards. So a necessary condition, we've just been talking about necessary and sufficient. Necessary condition for something to hold is a condition that must be satisfied in order for S to obtain. So more straightforwardly, it's something you need to have the thing in question. You can't have the thing without it. So if we're looking for knowledge, as I've just explained, we need to have justification. Otherwise, you just have a true belief, which could be coincidence. Sufficient conditions, on the other hand, for some state of affairs, S is a condition that, if satisfied, guarantees that S obtains. Again, less formally. In other words, this is something that when you have it, it automatically generates or makes the thing in question. So we said the justification, truth, and belief, according to the tripartite definition, are sufficient to have knowledge. Those, if taken together, are automatically enough to make knowledge. So, what's wrong with the tripartite definition? There's two ways of attacking it. Now, I'm going to focus mostly on the second one when it comes to essay planning, but for now, the first way of attacking it is about necessary conditions. Now, you wouldn't, I don't think, have to include this in essays, but if you can write a lot, then you certainly can do. So firstly, it's criticized by attempting to show that the conditions are not in fact individually necessary. So perhaps we can have knowledge without one of them. We've been assuming so far that the three things, justification, truth, and belief, all need to be there to have knowledge, but some philosophers think that there are examples that show you don't need to have all three. Secondly, I think more importantly and more damaging is Gettier's attempt. So Edmund Gettier writes this very famous kind of 4 or 5 page paper where he tries to give examples, quite strange examples, but examples that show that the three things are not in fact jointly sufficient to have knowledge. So that's a different kind of criticism to the first, and this is why it's so important to know the difference between necessary and sufficient. The first set of attacks revolves around necessary conditions, and the second really is focused on the three things not being sufficient. Now, Gettier himself doesn't actually come up with a better definition of knowledge, as far as I know. He just does this kind of famous paper criticizing it, and then it's generated a whole kind of debate since he wrote that paper on improvements to the definition of knowledge. So that's where, in the third lecture I'll put together, we'll discuss the possible responses. So let's have a look at the first way of criticizing it to start. So this was linked to the work from last week about kind of picking apart the three things and just seeing if we can take one of the conditions away and still have knowledge. How might this work? So let's start with belief. So you've got two ways of challenging the belief condition as necessary here. So first is a slightly more formal philosophical way. There is a position in philosophy known as infallibilism in epistemology. This is the view, and it goes back to Plato, the view that belief is different to knowledge, that the two things are actually not kind of incorporating each other, but actually fundamentally separate. So infallibilism is the view that belief is different to knowledge because belief is uncertain by its nature, and genuine knowledge is 100% certain. So if you remember back to the rationalism stuff, Plato and Descartes believed that things that you could be 100% certain of were knowledge. Plato has this slightly more extreme position that experience could only ever give you belief. So infallibilism says that genuine knowledge is not something that could be mistaken. Genuine knowledge is infallible. It cannot be mistaken. It's 100% certain. Now that's quite an extreme position, and we'll look at that a bit later on when we come to responses to Gettier. But for now, that's one way of saying that knowledge and belief are separate. Therefore, belief is not necessary for knowledge, because actually belief is a fundamentally different thing. Belief is uncertain, whereas knowledge is certain. That's one way of perhaps taking belief as a not a necessary condition for knowledge. Other ways might appeal to kind of psychology and the way in which perhaps sometimes we're not aware of certain things that we know. So secondly, we might say that we could know something without believing it if we point to forgotten or unconscious knowledge. So perhaps you blank on a test. You go in having perhaps not prepared enough or just panicking on the spot, and you write an answer in a rush, just have something down, and it turns out actually that was from your revision and you did know the answer, but at the time you didn't believe that was the case. You just kind of wrote something down for the sake of it. Now maybe in that case you knew something that you didn't believe. I think these examples are a little bit of a stretch perhaps, but this is the way that some philosophers have tried to generate a criticism of the belief condition not being necessary. Okay, the second condition that we're going to have a look at is the condition relating to truth. And this, I think, is a more difficult one. So it seems kind of obvious that to know something you have to be talking about something true. It has to be a fact in some sense, otherwise you couldn't know it. I think I explained in the previous presentation that I can't know that I'm Barack Obama, or I can't know that I'm on Mars if those are clearly false propositions. But there is a philosophical discussion here about what we mean by truth. And this perhaps is something that we could pick up on here. So most, I think, would agree that you would need truth to know something, but it might depend on what you mean by truth. So there are different theories of truth. So I think if you were challenging the definition, you would perhaps just go into a little bit of analysis of what we mean by truth here, and there is a whole kind of debate about this that we're not going to kind of get into too much here, but I certainly recommend, there's a lovely little book by Simon Blackburn, that the famous Cambridge philosopher, just on truth, and it's a really good introduction to the sort of philosophical debates around truth, why it might be important, and how it relates to some of the recent debates in sort of broader society about being a sort of post-truth society and the whole business about fake news and all that. So how could we unpack truth? What sort of thing do we mean by that here? Well, one theory of truth says that knowledge is where our belief fits in with other beliefs, or that truth is really a matter of coherence, or kind of fitting together with your other beliefs. This seems perhaps a slightly odd thing to say, but if you think back to historical examples where people didn't have the scientific knowledge that we have right now, certain things might have fit a sort of definition of knowledge if they all kind of added up for that person in that society with the beliefs that they held. So if people believed that the Earth was the centre of the universe, this might have fit in with or cohered with the beliefs that, for instance, the Church put forwards about the importance of humanity and so on, and how it seemed to everyday experience when you look at the sun apparently going around us. That, in that context, was a coherent view, because they didn't have the kind of scientific evidence of what actually happens as we know it today. So coherence is really about the person, the individual's internal set of beliefs and whether they all kind of add up together. That's one view of truth, coherentism. So that's one way of looking at this idea of truth. But perhaps a more intuitive idea is the idea of correspondence. And usually this is termed, coherence theory versus correspondence theories of truth. Correspondence is where our beliefs match how the world actually is. So this isn't an internal theory of what's going on in your mind with your own beliefs. It's whether your beliefs actually match up to the facts outside of you in the world. So we know now, because of science, that the example above is not in fact the case, because of Copernicus and experiments and space travel and all the rest of it. We know that the sun does not actually go around the Earth. It's the other way around. So that's something that we know as a matter of fact, because the science and so on has given us this new understanding. So the two definitions of truth then depend on, one, just what's going on in the person's mind with their other beliefs, so the coherence. The second theory of correspondence is about whether your beliefs actually match the facts of the world. Now, I don't want to overcomplicate this too much, but this sort of draws on what we talked about with skepticism in the perception unit. So let's say that you only ever have your own internal sense data and beliefs to go on. If we can't gain knowledge of things which are genuinely outside of that, then we have to stick to this coherence theory. However, if we do think that we can have beliefs that match up to the world outside of our minds, then that would lead us perhaps towards the correspondence theory. Okay, so the third condition that we have left then to examine is going to be justification. Now this is actually going to be unpacked much more in the section about the responses to Gettier, but there's a couple of things I think we could say about this initially. So first of all, it's an ambiguous term. You will see this from the various ways that people might offer to justify their beliefs. I've given some examples in the booklet. And this is going to be part of the issue. So defining knowledge as justified perhaps needs to be unpacked a bit more. So one problem to avoid in defining knowledge as justified is perhaps somehow smuggling in what we mean by justified to our definition of knowledge, therefore making it circular, therefore violating one of Zagzebski's key rules for definitions. So how might this work? Well, if we ask what's the difference between a true belief and knowledge, then we might kind of use this answer which goes back to Plato, well, knowledge is justified. But if we then ask, well, what does that mean? What does a justified true belief look like? Well, it's when you have knowledge, it's one which is knowledge worthy. Now that's sometimes at a sort of surface level, perhaps how this debate goes, and obviously that's not very helpful. That's just kind of going around in a circle, and that's something that we want to try and avoid. So trying to pin down what we mean by justification is going to be important here. So we'll look at attempts later on to replace this condition. So people talk in the theory of reliabilism of a reliably formed true belief, for instance. So that's one way of actually stripping out the notion of justification and replacing it with something perhaps more concrete. Okay, so we've discussed how you might challenge each of the three conditions as being necessary. Perhaps there's further analysis needed. Perhaps we can actually take one away and still have knowledge, depending on what the definitions are of the terms that we've talked about. So you do have to kind of drill down into the definitions of what we mean here and try and give examples to back these up, whichever way you go on this debate. As I said before, the central part of this debate revolves around Gettier's objection, and if you're writing a longer essay, I think you could potentially skate over some of the stuff that we've looked at and focus mainly on Gettier's criticism and then the debate that this generates from the various responses. So there are 4 responses to Gettier that we'll get into next time, but for now we just need to be clear on what his criticism is and why it's different to the sort of thing that we've just been talking about. So first of all, another sort of logical term to introduce here. We've talked about necessary and sufficient conditions. We also, I think, in this context need to know what it means for something to be entailed by something else. So entailment is a logical term about how propositions work or link up. And in this context, a sentence entails another sentence, or a proposition entails another proposition, if whenever the first one is true, the second one must also be true. So, for instance, if you believe that Arsenal lost the game, you must also believe that Arsenal played the game. Losing the game entails that they played the game. So this idea of entailment gets at the logical links between our various beliefs. And this is going to be important if you look at the definition of knowledge, as Gettier does, through a sort of logician's eyes. And he's looking at the links between our various beliefs and trying to work out how far this definition of knowledge actually goes. So the tripartite definition and Gettier's criticism, this is going to be the key thing. He gives quite a complicated set of examples. He gives 2 examples himself. I'm just going to mention one of his own examples and then perhaps a more straightforward one in a second. And in the booklet there are various other examples that you can kind of go through. You don't need to know them all, but you would need to, I think, know at least 1 or 2 here. So Gettier's criticism, the more straightforward of the ones that he gives is the Smith and Jones example. So Smith and Jones are both going for a job, and in the example that he gives, Smith believes that Jones will get the job. So the president tells him as much. Smith also, for some unknown reason, discovers and believes that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. So they're both going for the job. Smith believes on a separate level that Jones has these 10 coins in his pocket, which he does, and he's got some justification for the belief that Jones is going to get the job. And part of the example here, and this is the tricky bit, but this is the important bit, is that this entails the belief that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Now, we'll see why in a second this is going to be a justified true belief, which is not knowledge. So far, Smith has this belief that the person that will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. He believes that, he thinks on good grounds, because the president has reassured him or told him or hinted somehow that Jones is going to get the job, and he knows that Jones has these 10 coins in his pocket. The problem is that it turns out that Smith himself gets the job and not Jones, but by coincidence, and there's always this element of coincidence in the Gettier examples, he has 10 coins in his own pocket. So, while Smith had a justified true belief that the man who would get the job had 10 coins in his pocket, he did not have knowledge. He did not have knowledge because he was lucky in believing this, and this is the central point that Gettier wants to get across. You can have justification, truth, and belief, but still arrive at knowledge through luck. In other words, justification isn't enough to rule out cases of coincidence, of luck, of fluke. And remember, our central intuition for this whole topic was that knowledge is not something arrived at by luck. Gettier's point overall, therefore, is that JTB is not sufficient, is not enough to automatically generate knowledge. You can have a justified true belief and not have knowledge. Okay, there are a number of examples that we could talk about in this context. Some of these relate to the ones in the booklet. I think the most straightforward one for now is the example of the stopped clock. So, the idea of the stopped clock is that, let's say that you're walking through Waterloo Station, you look up at the big clock for the time, and it says that it's 1 o'clock. However, you don't realise as you glance at the clock that the clock is broken and that it just happens to be 1 when you look up at it. In this case, you have a belief which is true, so it is in fact 1 o'clock, and you have some justification because the big clock in Waterloo is usually right. So you've looked at, coincidentally, the clock just at the time when it had stopped, and it is in fact that time. Now, you've still got justification because usually that clock is right. So according to this kind of example, you don't have knowledge because the clock had in fact stopped unbeknownst to you. You still got the truth, you've still got an element of justification, and you still believe it. So all 3 conditions are there, but this is not in fact knowledge. This, I think, is the clearest example that shows that JTB isn't enough, is not sufficient to have knowledge, and that's Gettier's central point. So these are the central things that we need to take away from this, I think. So we know hopefully now what the tripartite definition of knowledge is. Why is it then that Gettier objects to this? And this is going to be where the kind of debate goes going forward. And you'll need to explain at least one Gettier example to show his point. There's a whole kind of industry out there pretty much devoted to coming up with Gettier examples. By all means, have a go at thinking of your own if you can do. What you'll need is the 3 conditions, some element of justification, truth and belief, and then some sort of twist or coincidence which shows that you don't have knowledge. That's really what Gettier is getting at. So we've looked at two sets of objections here. Firstly, that the conditions might not be individually necessary, that perhaps we could take away one, or at least one of the conditions might be interpreted in different ways. And then secondly, that the three things the tripartite definition sets forward are not sufficient because of Gettier examples. That's really the most important point here, and that's the one that we're going to be digging into and looking at responding to try and come up with definitions that get around Gettier examples. In other words, that rule out these cases and give us a definition of knowledge which doesn't allow these kind of coincidental cases to count as knowledge.